Good morning, everyone, and welcome back to the negotiators as well as the public. We have a very full agenda again today. So where we left off yesterday, we'll pick back up after we do our roll call. And any housekeeping item, we will move right into wrapping up the administrative capabilities with Debbie and a quick temperature check and move into the gainful employment. So let's go ahead and take our roll call. If everyone could turn on their cameras, and I'm going to remind you, as well as myself, of our naming conventions. If you please make those adjustments, we will get started. Okay. So if you just briefly say, acknowledge that your presence in however way you like, we'll get started. For accrediting agencies, we have Jamie Studley as primary.
Good morning from beautiful Sebastopol, California.
Good morning. And Dr. Laura Racer King.
Good morning, everybody.
Morning. For civil rights organizations and consumer advocacy organizations, we have Carolyn Fast.
Morning.
Good morning. And Jaylon Herbin.
Morning.
Morning. Financial aid administrators at post-secondary institutions, we have Samantha Veeder.
Good morning, everyone.
And David Peterson as the alternates.
Good morning, everyone.
Morning. For your public institutions of higher education, primary Marvin Smith.
Good morning.
And alternate Deborah Stanley.
Morning.
Good morning. Legal assistance organizations that represent students and or borrowers. We have Johnson Tyler, primary. Okay, I'm not hearing from Johnson. We'll circle back. And Miss Jessica Ranucci as alternate.
Good morning.
Good morning. Minority serving institutions, primary, we have Dr. Beverly Hogan. Beverly, you're on mute.
I'm sorry. Good morning, everyone.
Good morning. And Miss Ashley Schofield as alternate.
Good morning, everyone.
Good morning. For civil rights organizations, we have Miss Amanda Martinez.
Present. Good morning.
Good morning. Private nonprofit institutions of higher education, Miss Kelly Perry as primary. And not hearing from Kelly. And Mr. Emmanuel Gilroy as alternate. And I believe, Emmanuel, you're going to be sitting in this morning, correct?
That's right.
Okay.
Good morning.
Good morning. Proprietary institutions of higher education, we have Mr. Bradley Adams.
Morning.
Morning. And Mr. Michael Lanowet.
Good morning.
Good morning. State Attorneys General, primary Adam Welly.
Here, good morning.
Good morning, Adam. And Ms. Yael Shabbat. Morning. State higher education executive officers, state authorizing agencies, and or state regulators of institutions of higher education and or loan servicers. Primary is Miss Debbie Cochran.
Good morning.
Good morning. And alternate is Mr. David Sokolow.
Good morning.
Morning. Student and student loan borrowers, we have Mr. Ernest Izuego
Morning, everyone.
and alternate Mr. Carney King.
Good morning.
Morning. Two-year public institutions of higher education, we have Dr. Ann Crest.
Good morning.
Morning. And Mr. William Durden as alternates.
Good morning.
Morning. U.S. military service members, veterans, or groups representing them. Primary is Mr. Travis Hoare, who I don't believe is with us today. So Mr. Barmak Nassarian as the alternate will be sitting in his place.
Good morning.
Good morning. And And then for the department, of course, we have Mr. Gregory Martin.
Good morning.
Good morning. The general counsel sitting in today will be Mr. Steve Finley.
Hi, good morning.
Good morning. And our two advisors for compliance auditor with experience auditing institutions that participate in Title IV HEA programs, Mr. David McClintock.
Good to see everyone again.
And the other alternate is labor economist or individual with experience in public research, accountability, and or analysis of higher education data, Dr. Adam Looney. Dr. Looney, are you with us? Okay, well, he will be coming in later for gainful employment, as he will be, he does have a presentation for the committee today. Denise, you have your hand up.
I just wanted to let you know that I'm going to finish out administrative capability for the General Counsel's office, and then Mr. Finley will step in for gainful employment.
Okay, perfect. Thank you for that. Did I miss anyone?
Hi, I showed up late. Sorry, I'm here now.
Oh, there you are, Johnson. All right, great. Thanks. Welcome. I'm still not seeing Kevin, so I'm going to move into today's planned agenda. We'd like to take just a brief period of time to wrap up the administrative capabilities, and then we will move directly into gainful employment. The plan for gainful employment is that Greg will do a brief overview of that document. We will be asking that you hold all questions and comments while he does that. And from there, Dr. Looney will be doing his presentation, and then there will be 2 department staff members, as protocol permits, that will provide some additional information for the committee on gainful employment. At that point, then Greg will then pick up and start walking the committees through the entire document, and our discussion will ensue while he does that. Okay? Barmack.
Yes, very briefly, I will be to save time tomorrow on financial responsibility. I will be putting in chat a memo on the question of statutory authority for 2 of the provisions that the department has in its current regulations and its proposed regulations. I just wanted to submit that for the record today, so the department has and the negotiators have had a chance to look it over for tomorrow. Thank you.
And I'd like to offer up 2 as well, Barmack. If you want to send that to me, I'd be happy to send it out to all of the negotiators in the department as well, so they have a physical copy for themselves. That would be helpful.
Yes, ma'am.
All right. So with that, let's go ahead. Debbie Cochran, you had your hand up as we concluded yesterday and had to move on to public comment. Would you still like to comment on the administrative capabilities?
Sure, thank you so much. I had put it very briefly in the chat yesterday, but really the questions around, the issue of, legitimate high schools that may have closed, whether they're, charter schools or religious schools, basically any high school that is no longer open for a documentation to be obtained and that is not regulated or overseen by a state agency. I'm not sure how an institution would document the validity of their transcript. So I'm not sure if there's another path that's needed here or what the department was thinking about those institutions and those high schools.
Okay. Did you put that back in the chat today too, Debbie, or?
It was just at the end of the day yesterday, just kind of
okay
with a general question.
All right, and so it looks like the department doesn't have an immediate response to that. So if it's okay, they'll continue to look into that and get back with you. Is that okay
Sure.
with you? Okay, great. All right, so I'm seeing Brad and Barmack, and then hopefully we'll be able to take the temperature check. So Brad?
Yes, I had also asked a question in the chat as we kind of ran out of time yesterday on just what the definition of a business relationship is and whether or not that would include a financial relationship. If the department could just help us out there on the very end there for that would be great.
I can respond to that. I'll address the previous question too, to some extent. I mean, I do want to say that we do understand the difficulty for some students to obtain a copy of a high school diploma or a transcript. In some cases, you have students who are non-traditional students. It may have been years since they went to high school, and it may be a completely different part of the country. The school may have closed. There are difficulties associated with that. And then again, we are not requiring here that high school diplomas be collected for all students. In the case where it's necessary to, where there is a reason to believe that it's not valid, once a school or the department has reason to believe that somebody does not have a valid high school diploma, that does need to be resolved. We've tried to give a number of ways here that could be accomplished. And our goals here are to give us tools we need to address areas where we see significant abuse. So I just want to point that out. But it's a good comment. We will take it back. We definitely understand that there are situations where students have legitimate difficulty obtaining the credential or documentation, some documentation that they have it, even where they did obtain that. So we'll definitely take that back and see what we can do there. With respect to Brad's comment about the business relationship, a business relationship would certainly suggest that there's money, but it may not be. But I think it could also be, and I can ask Denise to step in here as well. It could also be a quid pro quo type thing where we're talking about relationships where the institution has some type of a business relationship with a provider of high school diplomas, and through that, students are funneled from that high school entity, which is not providing a legitimate high school education, to the post-secondary entity. So regardless of what that business relationship is, I think even if it might involve money, again, it might involve it might just involve a mutually beneficial situation where the post-secondary school encourages people to go to this provider of high school diplomas, and then that entity benefits from that, and then the school benefits in that those students are funneled back from that school to the post-secondary institution. So however that relationship exists, it would fall under this regulation. I'll leave it at that.
Thank you, Greg. Barmack?
Yeah, apropos Debbie's point, I would encourage the department to leave a little bit of room for extraordinary circumstances. We run into all kinds of situations where there are refugees who have fled their home country, don't have any records of anything. So it's important to be reasonable. If there is a suspicion, as I suggested yesterday, that you need to kind of bifurcate, in my opinion, the regulations to address potential fraud by the student versus potential fraud by the entity that purports to be a high school. Two separate things, and they have different solutions. And at the same time, you need some flexibility for extraordinary cases.
Thanks, Barmack. We'll take that back.
Thanks. All right, I see Emmanuel's hand, and then looks like we can move to the temperature check. So Emmanuel?
It was a question that I had yesterday in the chat, but it's regarding a high school diploma's validity, determining whether or not it's valid. And I was wondering whose responsibility is that? Is that the department's responsibility to determine if it's valid, the institution's responsibility, or the student's responsibility? And the reason why I ask is because the way that it reads is that it's the institution's responsibility, because it's administrative capability. And this is something that we had brought up last session of the additional burden that it is to then determine whether or not the high school diploma is valid and all these different things to determine that. But I just wanted to be clear as to whose responsibility it is.
Yeah, that's a good question, but you're correct. It is the institution's responsibility to determine the validity of the high school diploma. If there's reason to believe that there's a problem with it, then that is something which needs to be resolved, and it's the institution that determines whether the student is eligible and then pays based on the student being eligible. So it is the responsibility of the institution to make this determination. The student might certainly be involved in having to take measures to obtain the documentation, but ultimately looking at it and determining whether or not the student is eligible always rests with the institution. And so that would be the same here. But I would point out again that this is not I think that, you know, were this a requirement for every institution to obtain diplomas in every instance, some schools do that. And if a school's policy were that they do collect high school diplomas or transcripts for every student whom they admit, then it would be incumbent upon the institution to if they saw any problems, had any reason to believe that any of those were a problem, to follow up on that. So I don't think I don't think this is overly burdensome in that we're talking about instances where there is a problem, and we're resolving for that problem. So yes, there is burden, and that the school has to look into that, but it's always been a school's responsibility to determine if a student is eligible.
Okay. Thank you, everyone, for that. So seeing no additional hands, Greg, are we prepared to move to temperature check on, I believe it was 668.157, right? No, I'm sorry.
It's
No,
we're
it's,
looking at, admin capability.
I'm sorry, I had the wrong paper. Sorry.
Point 16.
I apologize, everyone. Okay. All right. So if we could see a show of hands or thumbs, I'm sorry, on that. On the administrative capabilities on V, correct?
V.
Yep, okay. All right, let's see. All right, I'm not seeing any thumbs down.
Thank you. Thank everybody for the discussion. It was very good.
Okay. So with that, let's move on to gainful employment and get started on that. Greg, if you would go ahead and, let me just give you a quick reminder. In the chat, we have been asked by the department to put in, Brady, I think it kind of got lost in there.
I just reposted it. This the
Reposted it, yeah.
up, but you should be able to see it.
Okay, there are 3 questions that the department asked us to put in the chat as a reminder for you as you move through the rest of this weekend and in between sessions on the information that they are seeking, that they asked for yesterday. So it's just there as a helpful reminder for you to provide that feedback to them. It would be greatly appreciated. Okay. So from there, Greg, you want to give us a brief overview of gainful employment?
Sure. We can start with gainful employment. Always daunting when you hear the word gainful employment. We have to get into this. It's I do want to say it's a lot. You know, we're talking about a whole subpart here, and I want to try to get through this today and balance the need to move through the paper without and also the need for allowing everybody to make whatever comments they want to about the document. So I'm going to try to balance that. It may be a little difficult, but again, I'm not trying to cut anybody off or preclude any conversation. So not my intention in any way. And if anybody feels they need to say something or stop and make a point, please let me know. During this though, I was going to do a brief overview, and introduce the topic again. So issue paper 3, gainful employment, as you're aware, we introduced this in the last session, in session 1, but we did not at that time have any mandatory text to give you. If you look at the overview, I'm not going to go through that again because the summary of issues rather, because we did that before, and I don't want to be redundant in doing that. But just in the area where it says proposal, I do want to go through a couple of these things just to sort of get us back on track as to what the department is proposing to do here generally. So we are going to establish a framework again for whether a program prepares students for gainful employment in a recognized occupation. As we go through this and you see and we walk through the text, and hopefully all of you have looked through that. Those of you who are familiar with the 2014 rule will certainly recognize a lot of this. That basic framework is retained for these rules with some notable exceptions, and we'll talk about that as we go through. We bring your attention here to what we want to do, the clarity as to the scope and purpose, which govern the determination of whether a gainful employment program is eligible for Title IV HEA funds, as well as the outcomes, as well as outline the reporting requirements for institutions. Some terminology includes the annual and discretionary earnings rate, which make up the debt earnings to DE, the definition of a GE program, and the program's classification of instructional programs, SIP code. So those terms will be used. And credential level, a small program and small program rates to assess the rates for all programs within a credential level that are otherwise too small to produce DE rates. So that is something new for that we're bringing in here that was not found in the 14 rules. And let's look down to 3, the framework for assessing gainful employment programs. As with the 2014 rule, the department will calculate a discretionary and annual debt to earnings rate. So as I said, those of you who were familiar with the 14 rule will find that will notice that has been retained. Institutions with a discretionary rate, DE rate of 20%, or an annual DE rate of 8% or less will be considered passing under the metric, as it was in 2014. A program that fails the DE rates in any 2 out of 3 consecutive years, award years, becomes ineligible for Title IV HEA funds. We can look at the process for calculating the DE rates. The rates will be calculated on an annual loan payment amounts that will be amortized over 10, 15, and 20-year periods, depending on the credential level. We'll look at that as we get into the reg itself, using debts for or on behalf of the graduates of the program, and using interest rates that are based on an average of rates for 3 or 6 years prior, based on undergraduate or graduate unsubsidized loans. The secretary also obtains aggregate median and earnings for each program from another agency, federal agency. The secretary will calculate a small program rate based on all of the small programs in a given credential level. Looking at procedures for issuing the rates will be calculated based on administrative data, which institutions will have an opportunity to update prior to calculation of the rates. This is a little bit different than the what we had before with the completer lists. So a little bit of a modification on that we'll look at as we when we look at that part of the regulation. As previously noted, earnings will be obtained from another federal agency, and the department will calculate the rates after removing from the debt calculation the number of students who are not matched in the earnings calculation. Under the process for determining DE rates, the secretary will notify institutions of the DE rates for each program and for their small programs. For GE programs with DE rates, the department will also notify the institution whether the program is passing, failing, or ineligible. And consequences for the DE rates. For programs that fail the DE rates, institutions will be required to provide a warning to current and prospective students. The warnings will be hosted through a website maintained by the secretary. So this is another change over the 2014 rules, with the secretary maintaining the site on which those warnings will be posted. Institutions will be required to share information to access that site along with a warning. The department will require students seeking to enroll in a failing program to provide attestation through the website that they have seen the warning. For ineligible programs, an institution is prohibited from dispersing Title IV HEA funds to students at the institution and cannot establish that program again for at least 3 years. We are establishing reporting requirements as well. Some additional information will need to be reported to this department to ensure DE rates can be calculated for each DE program. And this will include student level information on the program, attendance and withdrawal completion dates, private institutional loan debt, tuition fees, book supplies, and other equipment allowances. We are also, and I want to point out there that we'll see as we go through this, that it is our intention to, where possible, do our calculations administratively based on what institutions are already providing via the systems they participate through, such as such as NSLDS and COD. So we also are going to specify, and this is new under number 9 here, specify supplementary performance measures. So we are proposing to include certain data elements in consideration of an institution's application to participate in the federal programs. Prior to issuing a new PPA to an institution, we will assess and may take into consideration the withdrawal rates of the institution, the GEDE rates, and small program rates. If applicable, instructional expenditures of the institution and accreditor or state-related job placement, if any of that information is available. And we're also going to outline key certification requirements for the GE programs. The proposed regulations include a timeline for institutions to certify that GE programs meet certain other requirements, such as complying with the timelines for reestablishing eligibility and being accredited or included in the scope of the institution's accreditation. That's just a brief overview of what we're going to do. If you look at the regulation itself, I'll just draw your attention to a couple things here. You can see that we have made some changes in 600.10. We will be looking at updating application information in 600.21. We then would move into the program definitions under subpart Q. So the majority of what we'll be doing is looking at subpart Q. As I said before, you'll notice a lot of this comes from the 14 rules. And finally, we'll be looking at disclosures under 668.43. So I'm going to leave it at that for now and turn it back over to Cynthia. And then when our presentations are concluded, we will walk through the document. Thank you, Cynthia.
Okay, thank you, Greg, for that. Dr. Adam Looney has joined us. So he will be doing his presentation. But before we get to that, I want to note that David Peterson is in at the table for gainful employment on behalf of Financial Aid Administration constituency instead of Samantha Beater. My colleague Kevin Wagner has been able to rejoin the meeting, who was slated to facilitate this morning, so I'll be turning it back over to him. So, Kevin?
Sorry about that. Glad to be joining you all. And we're going to be joined by Dr. Adam Looney, who's an advisor and is going to give a presentation on gainful employment.
Okay, can I share my screen?
Sure.
Okay, can you see that? Or what are we looking at?
You can see it. Yeah, it looks like a opening slide for a PowerPoint presentation.
Yeah.
Right, we can see that. Yep, but that David Peterson's webcam broke yesterday. So although you may not be able to see him on your screen as a non-video participant, he is there. Okay. Go ahead, Dr. Looney.
Okay, thank you. I just wanted to respond to some of the questions that came up in our last session a month ago, and just to provide an overview of this, in part to spur some questions from the participants and see if there's an opportunity for me to be helpful here. I wanted to do a couple things. One was just to provide a summary of why accountability rules exist and what the evidence is about their efficacy. To review some of them. Second, to review some of the mechanics of the 2014 rule and potential modifications to it, and then just to provide an overview of what programs have been affected. So you can see the second slide, right? Okay. I just want to make sure I'm flipping through them properly. So in brief, 5 points about these programs. One is that there's a lot of evidence that post-secondary education can begin a ladder of economic opportunity and boost student earnings. Individuals with college degrees earn significantly more over the course of their careers. They are vastly more likely to move up into the middle class. And the educational workforces that are responsible for this opportunity are often mid-tier, non-selective, mostly public institutions, not elite or selective schools. And likewise, there are many career-oriented programs that offer degrees and certificates that boost their students' job prospects. And this is where federal aid is particularly important in providing access to those institutions. At the same time, despite that opportunity, there are large numbers of students that invest time and money in occupational programs that result in low earnings and or loans they can't repay, leaving them worse off than they were prior to enrollment. The weight of those failures falls most heavily on the most disadvantaged students. Just for example, Pell Grant recipients represent about 90% of all students who default on an undergraduate loan. And the evidence shows that poor student outcomes are primarily caused by low quality institutions and programs. Clearly, disadvantaged students are concentrated in programs with poor outcomes, but the research is clear about the direction of causality. The problem is the programs and schools, not the students. At any given college, for example, students from low and high income families have very similar earnings and repayment outcomes, even at non-selective institutions. Looking over the history of the student loan program, default rates have surged and declined many times. And that's not because the students in these programs have changed. It's because the programs that are eligible to participate in Title IV programs have changed over time. And across a range of outcomes like default rates, loan repayment rates, post-college earnings, callback rates of job applicants, the outcomes of students largely reflect the characteristics of the schools and not only the backgrounds of the students. And that's why accountability policies are effective in improving student outcomes. After a crisis, for example, in the student loan market in the 1980s, rigorous institutional accountability measures implemented at that time drove default rates down to the single digits. And likewise, much of the increase in default rates and falling repayment rates since 2000 was caused by the unwinding of those accountability rules, like changes in the 90-10 rule, the erosion of cohort default rate rules, elimination of historic learning rules, and as well as expansion of lending limits, particularly to graduate borrowers. And so, just related to that, in the 1990s, these accountability rules closed more than 1,200 institutions. But it's not that the students lost access to educational opportunities. Instead, the evidence is that they went to better schools and had better outcomes. And so the kind of broad consensus of the literature that has been examining the role of accountability in post-secondary education is that stronger accountability systems would have benefits in terms of improving student outcomes, reducing the costs of these programs to taxpayers. So that's the preview I have for each of these bullet points at the bottom of the presentation, which I assume will be shared at some point. I have, references to academic research on these topics that you can peruse for further reading. But that gets me to the 2014 rule, and this graph is an attempt to illustrate the how the rule worked. So as I just mentioned, there were two rules at a time. There was or rather, the rule was based on a debt service to earnings measure. Debt service was determined by the amount of debt at repayment, the interest rate, and then an amortization schedule that depended on the credential level that was being attained. So if it was a sub-BA credential, payments or the loan payments were amortized over a 10-year period. If it was a BA, they were amortized over a 15-year period. If there was beyond a BA, master's, doctoral, professional program, it was amortized over 20 years. That debt service was compared to two measures of earnings: an annual earnings threshold, an annual earnings amount, which was just the greater of the mean or median earnings of completers in the program, and a discretionary earnings test, which was the earning amount that exceeded 150% of the poverty line. And so I have illustrated those two rules on this graph. For a program to pass, it had to pass either of those tests. So for example, the black line in the chart shows this debt to annual earnings threshold. So programs whose debt to earnings were below the threshold in green would pass. Likewise, the blue line is the debt to discretionary income threshold. And so programs that had a debt to income level that was below that blue line passed. I've drawn this so that they indicate the 8% annual threshold and the 20% discretionary threshold. And so if you were on the other side of either of both of those lines, then those programs were failing. One other thing to say is I have represented here the levels of debt that correspond to failure for a sub-BA program. For a program that was a BA program, the debt amounts would be about 40% larger before you failed, and for a master's or a doctoral program, the levels of debt I think are about 80%, 70 or 80% higher. In other words, the longer amortization schedule allows programs to pass at much higher levels of debt and debt to earnings ratios. At that time, there was a lot of elements that were debated about that, and I will just mention them here. Perhaps the most important omission of the 2014 rule and of debt to earnings rules more generally is that there were large numbers of programs that could pass even with very poor economic outcomes, provided that the median program completer did not have debt. And so, for example, that could mean that if 51% of students did not borrow, then the program would automatically pass. That might leave other students who had attended the program with large levels of debt that were unmanageable to them. Likewise, it also meant that students and taxpayers could invest large amounts of time and money into a program that was intended to improve their economic outcomes, and yet not achieve that outcome because the outcomes were very poor. So for example, if programs were financed by GI Bill benefits, Pell Grants, Cal Grants, state investments, or paid out of pocket, then those programs could still pass, even though the outcomes of the students were quite bad. I think Ernest, I'm getting that name right, asked about completers versus non-completers. The 2014 rule was based on completers. At the program level, my sense is that there is just about no information about the non-completion at the program level, nor about the characteristics of individuals who complete or not complete at the program level. There is more information at the institutional level. I'm just going to mention that in passing because I don't have a lot more to say, other than obviously non-completion is is a significant problem at a lot of institutions and leads to a lot of poor outcomes for students and student loan borrowers in particular. But as designed, that rule only focuses on completers. During the 2014 rulemaking, there were lots of questions about the role of underreported income. And so in the references at the bottom of this presentation, I have included a paper that has tried to analyze this question. It's been a question that researchers have subsequently tried to answer. The conclusion of that paper was that the magnitude of underreported income is relatively small and has little role in the success or failure of programs like cosmetology under the 2014 rule. On a related note, I'll just mention certain programs that were more likely to fail the 2014 rule are programs that primarily exist to fulfill state occupational licensing rules. Feels like cosmetology, barbering, massage therapy, aesthetics. The programs are costly. The earnings of graduates are very low. And I think economists, the consensus of the economics literature is that those programs aren't intended to educate students so much as they are to impose barriers to employment in those fields to protect incumbents. And so this is an area where I would just mention that the Department of Education or the educational system is thrust in the middle of the state policymaking process. Another thing that came up last time, and I have included a couple papers to that effect to analyze the role of occupational licensing and debt in the reference section. Last thing to say is the 3-year reporting timeframe. That seems to be a robust timeframe to measure outcomes, and I've had some reference to that. Finally, I think we talked last time, and I think people have proposed augmenting the 2014 rule with a earnings threshold. So just as an illustration, you can imagine drawing a vertical line like this black dashed line at some level of program earnings, and then saying if the typical earnings of graduates of the program are below that threshold, then the program would fail the rule. The main consequence is that programs with very low levels of debt but very low levels of earnings would fail the rule. And just to give you an illustration of how these rules would work, this table uses the 2015 data produced in 2017 by the Department of Education related to the 2014 rule and augments it with compares that rule to one in which there's a $20,000 earning threshold. And so just to read across the columns in this table, the first column is the total number of programs that have degree recipients according to the Department of Education's IPEDS data. The second column is the number of degrees completed in 2015 based on that data. So like 5 million students received degrees. The third column is the number of gainful employment programs in the 2015 database. That database excludes very small programs. And so that's part of the reason why there are some proprietary school programs that are not in the gainful employment data. The fourth column is the number of programs that would fail the 2014 rule. So about 2,000 out of the 8,000 programs would fail. However, those programs represent a very small number of the total programs offered by post-secondary institutions in the United States. The next column is if you added a $20,000 earnings threshold, that increases the number of programs that fails by about 1,600. And then the last two sections provide some interpretation. So that shows the fraction of programs fraction of total post-secondary programs that would fail the rule under these two thresholds. So of all programs, 1% of degree granting programs would fail the 2014 rule. 1.7 would fail that rule augmented with a $20,000 earnings threshold. It varies enormously by sector. So public 4-year programs, almost no programs fail. Even community colleges, almost no programs fail. Failures are highly concentrated in the proprietary sector and also in the private non-for-profit sector. I also got some questions about the kinds of programs that are most likely to fail. So the right-hand side of this chart shows the descriptions of I've just ranked them by programs that were most likely to have a failing program by the description of the program. So cosmetology, assistant programs, and you can see that the earnings in those fields are quite low. The reason I produced this was that people had asked whether teachers or early childhood education specialists or people in public service were likely to fail, and those are not the characteristics of programs that are likely to fail. Just because they have higher earnings and the levels of debt are not that high. I should also emphasize that even programs that have failing programs, most of them also have not just passing programs outside of the gainful employment space, but they also have passing gainful employment programs. So students often have better options, not just in general at another institution, but often at the very same institution. And then the rest of my presentation is references. So I thought I would pause there and turn it back over. And I'm happy to answer questions.
Thank you, Adam. I really appreciate that. Does anyone have any questions? There you go. Let's see, we see Johnson. Go ahead.
Hi, thanks, Adam. That's a really, really interesting and clear presentation. I didn't understand your statement that if an institution had less than 51% borrowers, that they wouldn't be covered by the 2014 gainful employment rule.
That rule was based on the median debt. And so if the median student had not borrowed, then the median debt of the program completers would have been zero. So it would have had people who owed debt potentially, but it would not necessarily have been subject to the rule.
Thank you.
Brad, you're up.
Yes, thank you, Adam. I just had a quick question, or really a confirmation on that last chart you showed, just to confirm that it was only including programs subject to the 2014 Gainful Employment Act, and that was not a review of how all programs would have fared under those GE metrics.
You mean the second to last chart that showed the fraction of programs that fail under alternative rules?
Yes, if it was just the programs that were subject to the 2014 rule, or is that all programs and how they would have fared if they were subject to the rules?
The table showed all programs, of which not all are gainful employment programs.
Right.
And so only a small number of all programs are subject to the gainful employment rules. And so the reason that the effect is so concentrated in the proprietary sector is that the vast majority of programs at nonprofit and public institutions are exempt from the legislation, exempt by legislation from the gainful employment system review.
Thank you for confirming. Thank you.
Debbie, you're next.
Thank you. Yes, I had also a clarifying question about some of the data, and particularly around the impacts. And the note, I believe, said something like 2015 GE data with, I think, 2017 iPads. And I'm wondering if what we're looking at in that slide is kind of an analysis of what the outcomes would be based on the old data, after which, we know that there was industry response, a lot of programs closed, or is that a more updated analysis using iPad's data or scorecard?
It is the same. It is the same. I should have been clear. It is the 2015 gainful employment data, and it is the 2015 iPads data. It's just that there was a lag. The 2015 data was not released until 2017, which is maybe a detail I did not need to include. But it is not, clearly a fair number of programs did close after this. And so it is not updated for that. And I suspect that the information would look quite somewhat different today.
And so it probably, any of the programs, if to the extent that some of those failing programs close, then that chart would actually overstate impacts. Is that correct?
That's right. Yes. No, a number of the schools that had the largest numbers of failing students have since closed. And so the total number impacted, they closed because of, I think, legal action. And so I think that the total number of students and programs that would be impacted by the rule would be smaller.
Okay, Marvin, you're up.
Adam, thanks for this data. Some of the things we're thinking about in terms of the timing of when GE rules are implemented is the problem of looking at income data for 20 and 21 with the pandemic. And I know that this is based on using 3-year averages, but do you have an opinion on ways to look at an expanded 5-year average, or how would you deal with the loss of income during the pandemic?
Well, just as a matter of data production, my understanding is that the reporting requirements that produce this data were terminated during the last administration, and so that infrastructure does not exist. And so, getting that apparatus back up and running is going to take several years. And so I think that there will not be data available for these years. In fact, I suspect it will be several years before. I think the pandemic will, in practice, the pandemic will be over by the time there are rates produced. That said, just a clarifying thing, these data are it is the earnings in the 3rd year after program completion. So it's not an average. It's in the 3rd year, and it's 2 combined cohorts typically. So it would actually, I don't know if it is for gainful employment, but typically it is not an average. It's a point in time estimate of the earnings of graduates.
Okay, thank you. Emmanuel, you're up.
So the question I have actually is different from what Adam just said, but with what Adam just said, I think I have a question about that, but we'll get back to that. So Adam, thank you so much for your presentation. Thank you for the time and effort and energy to put that together. So I really appreciate that. I wanted to ask you a question about some of the data that you had around the total programs, degrees completed, GE programs at the various different sectors of institutions and types of institutions. So with GE programs that you had listed, and particularly I'm talking about the slide that says scope of the rule and who is affected. So for example, for private nonprofit 4-year, you have that 173 programs at all of private nonprofit 4 years or more. There was only 173. I just wanted to clarify that what that data is telling us is that there were only 173 programs with 30 or more students in the cohort that were considered, that actually had to be published as GE programs. And the reason why I just want that clarification is because the department put out data as well from federal student aid regarding GE programs that, list the total amount of GE programs versus the amount of GE programs that are actually published. And that has to deal with the cohort number. So I wanted to make sure that was what you were showing us.
I'm showing the published numbers. So there are more GE programs than there are published data. And so these are the ones that have published data, and the ones that are too small, so to speak, are not in this table.
Okay.
And I mean, frankly, I don't know how they're treated in the, it's a question of how they should be treated, because the numbers of students are quite small in many of these programs.
Right. Well, we're going to get to this later, but since the department will be proposing to calculate rates on small programs, then those programs would then also be included. So recent data does show us that in the nonprofit sector, there were over 18,000 programs that qualified as GE programs, but only 2,956 of those programs were actually published. So now with new proposals that we'll talk about later, I think all of those additional programs will now be, rates will be calculated on those programs too. So.
Yes, I mean, I can see how many programs have, undergraduate certificates at those programs. It seemed like I could, that's an answerable question. So I could see, they publish the number of students that get degrees in those programs. And I could count those.
Okay, thank you.
Just want to announce that Jalen Herbin, representing Civil and Consumer Rights, is in, and he's up to ask a question. So take it away, Jalen.
Okay, just real quick, Jalen, addressing questions in the chat. Dr. Looney, is it all right if I go ahead and send out your presentation to the entire committee at this point?
That's great.
Okay,
Thank you.
got it.
Thanks, Cindy. Go ahead, Jalen.
Thank you so much for that presentation. It was really helpful. One thing that struck me was the $20,000 earnings threshold. It seems to be very low. I guess really one thing that we're concerned about is a lot of the single families that we represent, single parents, actually 150% of those of the federal poverty level is actually above $25,000. Greg, can you tell us how much this number, how this number was determined? And is it because 150% of the poverty level of families are one of them, or how did you come up with that $20,000?
I use $20,000 as an illustrative example. I don't know that the department has a particular dollar amount that it is picked on. I mean, I agree with you that $20,000 isn't enough to live on as a family. So at the same time, I wanted to pick something that was illustrative and would give you a sense of what the impact was.
Right.
Oh, sorry. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
And just real quick, I guess is the department willing to like rethink that number, or is Greg willing to share what number they're looking at for this?
We haven't discussed a number with relation to that yet. As Dr. Looney pointed out, that was a figure he used for illustrative purposes, but that does not relate to any number that we have. We do 1.5 times the HHS poverty guideline is incorporated into the calculation of discretionary income rate, but that's not what that comes in. It's not a dollar figure.
Thank you.
Barmack, go ahead.
That was an excellent presentation. It was the most compelling overview I've seen. And I have a question for you with regard to the amortization terms for graduate programs. I mean, the 10, 15, and 20-year amortization terms are obviously like any number you pick, it's quite arbitrary. Is there a way of justifying particular amortization terms on the basis of like expected wage differentials associated with different credential levels?
Well, I thought that in part the different amortization schedule was motivated by some sense of the time frame over which students typically would repay a loan, or the projected time frame over which a student would expect to have a boost to their earnings. Although I'm not sure exactly what the exact correspondence is between, I don't know exactly how we got to a 10, 15, 20 schedule for that. So that I think that's a good question to ask. Obviously, the different amortization schedules do imply very different levels of debt that are acceptable, and so it is a good question to ask whether those are the appropriate levels of debt relative to the earnings boost that students presumably get from those more advanced degrees.
Edit format? Okay, just want to let everyone know we have, let's see, there are 3 folks still in the queue. Want to remind you guys to try to keep the questions brief. If you have additional questions, feel free to send them to FMCS. We'll forward them to Dr. Looney, and then we'll be turning it back over to Greg. So the next person I see in a line is Emmanuel.
Yes, I want to ask that second question that I had mentioned. And so, Adam, I think my colleague Marvin had brought up the pandemic and how that could potentially impact these DE rates. And I believe that you had mentioned that by the time we would have DE rates calculated, it wouldn't include the pandemic. Did you say that? I don't want to put words into your mouth. So
I mean, I defer to the mechanics at the Department of Education who will be responsible for collecting this data, but my sense is that the institutions have not been reporting who is enrolled in their programs, will not report that information to the Department of Education until the department issues a new rule. And so only then will the department know who is enrolled in a particular program. And then 3 years after that, will we know the earnings of those individuals. And maybe the timeline is slightly shorter than that, but I think it's quite a long timeline.
Okay, the reason why I ask is because this rule, let's say it goes into effect July 1st of 2023. And I don't think the department will be able to then calculate DE rates for year 2023, 2024 academic year, but if that was the case, then 2019, 2020, and 2020, 2021 would be included. But let's say that rates aren't calculated until 2024, 2025 academic year. Well, then you have 2021, 2022, or 2020, 2021, 2021, 2022, that would be included. So since we're still in the pandemic and it's 2022, it just seems like the pandemic would have an impact on these DE rates. And I would hate for institutions to have a score that is failing, obviously, but due to, elements that are not in their control. So I just wanted to highlight that.
Sure. Just to try to clarify, I think, but again, I defer to someone at the department who might know better, that you can have a rule that says, please report who has graduated from your GE program. We report the number of students as of, who graduated in the year 2022 or maybe the year 2023. And then we check how much they earned in year 2025 or 2026. And the debt to earnings ratio is the ratio of the debt, amortized debt that they graduated with in 2022 or 2023, divided by the earnings in 2025 or 2026. In that sense, it seems like it's relatively far out.
Thank you. We have Adam, Ann, and then we have Johnson. And if I could ask the negotiators to hold off on joining the queue after that and to submit any further questions to FMCS, that'd be great. Just in the interest of time. Been a very good discussion. Let's go ahead. Adam, you're up.
Sure. I'll add my thanks to Dr. Looney for this presentation. I found it very helpful. I just wanted to follow up on one comment. There was a mention about those low earnings programs and that there was some academic literature out there suggesting that those programs are not necessarily there to provide necessary training, but are more serving as barriers for incumbents. And I'm wondering if Dr. Looney, if it'd be possible to circulate any of that literature or say anything more about that.
Sure. I mean, I'm happy to. There's a paper that's forthcoming on exactly this topic, and there's another paper that I've included in the references of this slide. But I mean, just to give you a couple pieces of data, the educational requirements to enter cosmetology, I think that they require something like 2,000 hours of educational investment. That is among the largest of any field. So like to be an EMT, you need 150 hours of training. To be an electrician, I think in the median state, you need 0 hours of occupational training. In a lot of these fields, you don't, there's not an educational requirement. And so I think if you look at the relationship, for example, between how many hours of training states require and the earnings of students who graduate from those programs, there is no relationship. So it's not like if you go to school, if your state requires 2,000 hours of education instead of 1,000 hours, you don't make twice as much, you don't make 1% more. In contrast, the students who graduate from the 2,000-hour program have a lot more debt than students who graduate from the 1,000-hour program. And so clearly that is an area where the state policy is driving the costs and the debt rather than solely being a function of the institution.
Anne, go ahead.
Thank you. And I also want to thank you for the presentation. I also want to thank you for the last point that you made, because I think it's very important for folks to understand that in most of these cases, when there is a professional licensure that results, this is not within the control of an educational institution to determine the criteria for sitting for those exams or receiving those licenses. So to me, that's really important. I really wanted to ask about the income threshold, since that seems to be of great interest in this conversation. What you provided was an average, which is wonderful, but an average doesn't tell the whole story, right? I'm in Virginia, I'm in Northern Virginia. The wages that you would see in my part of the state don't look anything like you would see in the more rural parts of the state for all sorts of reasons. And so I just want to caution us against the challenges that averages present. You know, there are about 260 rural community colleges. They serve close to 700,000 students. The economic situation, what employers can and will pay in those markets, very different than what you would see, you know, in Alexandria or Annandale. Here in Northern Virginia. So I think we just want to be really mindful about that in many cases, even though the wages would not look large and are not large to anyone who lives in an urban area, they could be a significant step up for somebody who lives in a more rural area.
Carolyn, you'll be the last question. It doesn't mean that others, if there's additional questions, you can't send them. FMCS will direct them to Dr. Looney. But last but not least, Carolyn, go ahead, and then we're going to have to resume negotiation.
I just wanted to say also thank you to Dr. Looney for a really helpful presentation. And I wondered if, I had more of a comment than a question really quickly, and I wondered if it would be possible to share the really helpful graph that was showed, if that's possible, for the one that just showed the 2014 gainful employment rule without the earnings threshold. I don't know if it's possible, but the only reason I say this is that I thought it was a really useful way to think about the visualization. For me was very helpful, and it made me I thought it was very useful in terms of thinking about the different earnings threshold metrics that the department had proposed, especially the fourth one, which I'm sure we'll talk about later. But the only reason I'm raising it now is that I thought that graph was a really helpful way to see what would happen if we took the debt to earnings metric out, and we could, and I thought since we had the metric near us, we could look at it now, but maybe we can do that later if that's possible. It doesn't look like it can be shared now.
I'm going to have that circulated. So.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Carolyn, and thanks for everyone for their questions. And I'm going to go ahead and turn it back to Craig.
Point of order. Do we have the presentation data from Ed first? Brady?
I believe we do.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Greg, I'll ask your team, have they entered the Zoom meeting yet? I actually didn't see them in the waiting room.
Brady, Christopher is in the meeting already, or at least he was a minute ago.
Oh, I do see Chris. Hey, Chris,
Yeah.
you want to come on camera and
He
introduce
is
yourself?
on camera. Yes, he is on camera. So Chris, Are you going to be the first speaker for the from the department staff?
Thank you for having me. My name is Chris Bennett, and I'm a statistician in the Office of the Chief Data Officer. And I'll be talking about two memos that we put together in response to earlier requests, I believe in the first session. And afterwards, my colleague Brian Fu and I will be happy to take any questions that you have. So I believe someone was going to be sharing the two memos, is that right? Thank you. So I'll just briefly walk through these. So overall, this first memo, which I believe was shared with you, the goal of the small cohort sizes analysis was to examine the extent of suppression due to small cell sizes, both in terms of the share of programs that are affected and the share of students enrolled in those programs whose outcomes can't be disclosed. And for this analysis, the threshold that was used was less than 30 completers per cohort to identify small programs, and that's the same threshold that was used in the 2014 GE rule. And so this data, a little bit about it, here when we're talking about programs, we're talking about a unique combination of institution, as indicated by 6-digit OPE ID, program of field of study measured by 4-digit zip code and credential level. This analysis is based on award years 2016 and 2017. The median debt is based on program completers, not just borrowers, as Dr. Looney mentioned earlier. We used a version of debt that excludes Parent Plus loans, again for reference. It's based on third-year earnings after program completion. And here we're comparing the published data against a universe file that looks at all programs that have any completers, not just 30 or more completers. So briefly, I'll talk through table 1. Here, we're looking at the share of GE programs and completers that have fewer than 30 graduates in a cohort, broken out by institutional control. And so what you see here on the left-hand side of the screen is the share of GE programs that have less than 30 Title IV completers. And so what we see is that in the 2-year cohort for award years 2016 and 2017, the majority, 88% of the programs at public institutions, 88% of the programs at nonprofit institutions, and 55% of programs at proprietary institutions were small, too small to be shown. But then on the right-hand side of this table, what you see is that the percent of actual completers, so the share of students in those small programs is significantly smaller. So those small programs represented 40% of students, completers at public institutions, 22% at nonprofit institutions, and 4% of proprietary institution completers. So it's a lot of programs, a smaller share of actual completers. Here, you'll notice there are 2 rows, 2-year cohort and 4-year cohort. So that 2-year cohort, again, is for award years 2016 and 2017. The 4-year cohort here is an estimate where we doubled the number of completers from 2016 and 2017. So we were looking to see what would happen if we doubled the length of time that we examined for a cohort. And as you can see, if you doubled that time, the share of programs that were small went down by about 10 to 12 percentage points on the left-hand side for all control types. And then on the right-hand side, it reduced the number of students who were in small programs by about half. So it went from 40% of students being in small programs, completers being in small programs, in public institutions, to 22% if you were to double the length of time you looked at, if you looked at 4 years rather than 2. And then we can shift down to the bottom of table 1. And so, sorry that's broken up by that page, but in essence, the last 2 lines of table 1 show you the total number of programs or completers that are in that type of institution, and then the additional coverage that you would get by extending the period to a 4-year cohort rather than a 2-year cohort. So those numbers give you a sense of essentially what the additional coverage would be in reportable counts if you extended the length of time for each cohort. We'll move on to table 2. And so table 2 gives a little bit more granularity. So it looks specifically at the percent of GE programs that had fewer than 30 graduates in a cohort, and it's broken out by credential level and control. And so the broad indication here is that the largest number of programs are at the undergraduate certificate level across all control levels, public, nonprofit, proprietary. And what we see, a broad pattern, is that at public and nonprofit institutions, and could we scroll down just a little bit more to see the full table? Thank you very much. What we see is at public and nonprofit institutions, 80+% of programs are not able to be disclosed because they are small programs. That's true regardless of whether you're looking at a 2-year time period or expanding it to that 4-year time period. At proprietary institutions, the coverage is a little better. Broadly, what we see is that the largest category, undergraduate certificates, about half of programs are not able to be disclosed at proprietary institutions, 48%, and it gets up to 50s and 60% being too small to report for different credential levels. So overall, this is just a much more detailed view of what share programs by credential type and control are not able to be viewed because the sizes are too small of the completer cohort. We can move on to table 3. And so for table 3, this is again focusing on the number and share of completers. So whereas table 2 looked at the share of programs, table 3 is focusing on the share of completers. What we see here is that for public institutions and nonprofit institutions, again, zeroing in on that largest category, undergraduate certificate programs, 39% of completers, at public institutions are not able to be shown due to small program size at the 2-year window. At public institutions, at nonprofit institutions, 12% of undergraduate certificate completers are in small programs, and only 4% of completers at for-profit undergraduate certificate programs are in small programs. And again, you can walk through each different level to sort of get that indication. But the overall point or the overall takeaway for this here is that a relatively smaller share of students are in small programs, even though the share of programs that are small is a little bit higher. And so that's sort of the broad strokes for the small cohort sizes. And this is intended to give a broad vantage point of what kind of coverage we currently have using a model of 2-year cohorts and how that might change if you extended it to 4 years. So with that, I'll pause here and see if there are any questions about this memo before moving on to the second memo.
Johnson, you're up.
Yeah, thank you, Chris. I have 2 questions. The first is, what's the difference between a completer and a graduate? I don't understand the difference in table 2 and table 3. They seem to be measuring something else.
Those terms may be used interchangeably. This is measuring completer, so we may have just used graduate and completer. Okay. But they're intended to mean the same thing.
Okay, thank you. And then the other question I have is this based on a 6-digit zip code or a 4-digit zip code?
This is, I believe it's based on a 4-digit zip code.
Okay.
I can confirm, but I believe it's 4-digit.
Is that it, Johnson? Okay, Debbie, you're up.
Thank you. My question was very similar to Johnson's last question about the zip code level. And I think just because that's a difference between the 2014 rule and what's proposed here. So also if you, whichever one this is, if you have also the alternative, that would be helpful to see as well.
I can take that back and double check for you.
Thank you.
Brad, go ahead.
Thank you, Chris. So, my takeaway here is because of the small N sizes at the public and nonprofit institutions that have GE programs, that the majority of them are not subject to the DE calculations. Is that correct? Is that what I can read from this?
This table is showing that the majority of programs, though not the majority of students at those programs, are in small programs.
Which are not subject to GE?
They are not able to have the rates calculated because of the small size.
Thank you.
Okay, I don't see any other questions. Chris, take it away.
All right, I'll move on to the second memo then. And so in the second memo that was distributed to folks, we're focusing on the effect of capping total loan amount at the tuition, books, fees, and supplies. And so this is based on the 2014 GE regulation. That was the policy that median debt levels were capped based on an institution's tuition, fees, books, and supplies. Here, the data that we are using for this analysis is the official DE metrics, the 2015 GE rates, and that included the 8,650 programs with published data. Since I know that question came up earlier, this is again based on the published data. And here what we did was to do a reanalysis in which we did not apply the cap based on tuition, fees, books, and supplies. And so in broad strokes, in this third paragraph, what you see is that of the 8,650 programs in the data, more than 2/3 had median cumulative debt of borrowers that was the same, regardless of whether you applied the cap or not. So for the majority, more than 2/3, there was no change. And so we did want to look at that by credential level. So the first table here does show how that shakes out by credential level. And so generally what you see is that the fraction of programs where applying the cap would reduce the median total loan debt increases along with credential levels. So at undergraduate certificate level, only about a quarter would have a median total loan debt that was reduced as a result of the cap. But by the time you get to graduate programs, it's about 97% of those programs would have a lower total loan debt, median total loan debt if the cap were applied. So this just gives a sense at each of those levels. And it's also worth noting in this table, again, that the vast majority of GE programs from the 2015 G rates were at the undergraduate certificate and associate degree level. So while the share of programs that would have their rates, their median debt reduced at the graduate program level is pretty high, there aren't that many programs at the graduate level, especially relative to those undergraduate credentials. We then look at the 32.5% of programs where calculating the median total debt where removing the cap would increase their debt levels. And there what we see is that the changes to their median debt would vary considerably. So overall, the median change, if you were to remove the cap, would be an increase of about $1,161. Again, this is only among those that would see a difference. And 25% of the programs would see an increase of about $3,800. And the highest 10% of changes would see an increase of over $10,000. And there are a smaller number, about 94 programs that would have a measured increase of about 20,000. And those are, again, primarily at the graduate level where we see the more extreme changes. And so taken together, the impact of removing the cap based on tuition fees, books and supplies would be to have 2.3% of the passing programs would be reclassified into either failing or zone if the tuition, books, fees, and supplies cap were removed. That's the high-level summary of the impact of removing that tuition fees, books, and supplies cap, and I'm happy to take any questions you have.
Marvin, you're up.
Yeah, a couple of questions. On the second paper, can you or did you look at breaking out by institution type, private, public, for profit?
That is something that could be done. I don't recall that specific analysis being done already, so that's something I can take back as well.
And then a quick follow-up. It just seems like we still need. Are we going to get to more data? Because with the department proposing getting rid of the pass-fail zone, has the department looked at how that might impact programs in schools by institution type?
I'm not sure where that type of analysis stands, so I would have to ask.
Johnson.
Yeah, this is all very interesting and informative, but I'm curious if you can associate the number of students enrolled in some of these programs, so we have a better sense of how gainful employment would affect the public by and large. Because by looking at simply at the programs that are affected, we don't know if a program is drawing tens of thousands of students who are not benefiting from it versus one of these small programs that only has 20 students. They're kind of weighted equally in this analysis, it seems to me.
I can add that to the list of things to examine, along with the breakout by institution type, also weighted it by the number of students as another supplementary analysis that I think would be feasible with the data.
Thanks.
Cormac.
I have to confess that I found that the findings are a little counterintuitive to me. And I'm wondering whether you could speculate as to what the cause could be. You would expect, what the data suggests is that graduate students are borrowing for subsistence purposes at a much higher rate than certificate students. Wouldn't that be the distinction, that there's living costs being covered with loans in the case of graduate programs, but that the certificate students are just basically borrowing to cover tuition?
I am reluctant to speculate, so I'm not sure what the source of it is, but it would be something beyond tuition fees, books, and supplies.
Thank you.
Dave, go ahead.
Yeah, I think I can answer some of that question. It's the way the median cap is used. So there's no, in the 2014 GE rates, there was no consideration given for grants and other payments that are received. So if a program costs $10,000 and a student got $6,000 of Pell and took out the $9,500 of first year loans to pay for the program, it just compared so in that example, they had $4,000 left to pay for the program. They're taking a $5,500 stipend to cover living expenses while they're going to school. The previous rate compares the cost of tuition to the loans that were borrowed. So in my example, the $9,500 was being included with or without the cap being applied. And so I think because of that fact, you're not seeing the decrease when you add the cap, most of it, or when you get rid of the cap, most of the loans were being included already. And so removing the cap has a much smaller impact on the median debt.
Okay. Any other questions? All right, thank you very much, Chris, for the presentation. I'm going to go ahead and go right to the next department presenter. That'd be Brian Fu.
I'm sorry, nothing further from me. I was just just supporting Chris. Thank you.
Okay, no problem. Then I'll go ahead and turn it back over to Greg.
Thank you, Kevin, and I want to thank our presenters, Dr. Looney and Chris, for those excellent presentations that they did. Very informative. So as we're looking back at the GE paper again, and I want to, in light of, I seem to have lost my screen. Hold on a second. Bear with me a moment.
Renee, you're sharing the wrong document.
Oh, thank God it wasn't me.
Yes.
Thanks, Renee. Appreciate it. It's good to get a little jolt once in a while. So we're going to go and look at these regulations and walk through them. I think what I'd like to do, in view of how much we have to get through and the time frame that we've got to go through it. As I said previously, we are going back to a lot of what was in the 14 rule, and although those rules are not currently extant because they were taken down, they were existing rules, and so what I want to concentrate on are the changes that we've proposed here. So in view of that, I would like not to read through every line of a mandatory text, because I don't think we would ever get through all of it if I do that. However, as we go through, if there are areas that we're not hitting that you want to discuss in more detail or want further clarification on, please let me know. So again, I'm trying to engage in this balancing act between covering everything and being mindful of the timeframes that we have. So let's just begin then with. I'll consider all of the beginning with 600.10, the date, extent, and duration of eligibility. So just starting there before we get into subpart Q. We have made an update in this section to add that institutions must report updates and changes to their gainful employment programs, including meeting any restrictions on reestablishing a GE program as part of seeking eligibility for those programs. So you can see there in C, eligible programs, go down to one where it says here Romanet 4, and this actually we have Romanet 4 indicated here. Oh no, we would change it to Romanet. Be certain that we have coding. Make sure I've got what you've got there, right? Okay, so this should be we go down to for gainful employment under 34 CFR 668. Update the application under 600.21 and meet any time restrictions that prohibit the institution from establishing or reestablishing eligibility. So, and yeah, there we go. And you'll see there that says Romanet 4, but I want to point out that this should actually be Romanet 5 because through the prison education rulemaking, we have already proposed to add a new Romanet 4 to that paragraph, which would say that for the first eligible prison education program under subpart P of 34 CFR part 668 offered at the first at the first two additional locations as defined in 600.2 at the federal, state, or local penitentiary, reformatory work farm, or juvenile justice facility, or any other similar correctional institution. So 4 will be that rule that pertains to prison education, and this will be 5. So no text is changing here related to GE, but when the prison education rules are final, that would be the way that would read. So that's the only change there under 600.10. We'll go down to 600.21, which is updating application information. So let's take a look at this. We have modified the language in this section to include reporting on the credential level of GE programs, as well as updates to certifications for those programs. You can see here under reporting requirements for any program that is required to provide training that prepares a student for gainful employment, establishing the eligibility or reestablishing, discontinuing the program's eligibility, ceasing to provide the program for at least 12 months, losing eligibility under 600.40, or changing the program's name, zip code, or as we've added here, credential level, or updating the certification pursuant to 668.410. And that's where the certifications are included, and we'll get to that later on as we walk through the document. So that concludes everything that's not related, that's not part of subpart Q. So I wanted to get through all that first, and I'll ask if there are any questions related to that before we move on to the bulk of this, which will be in proposed subpart Q.
Thank you, Greg. Brad.
And thank you, Kevin and Greg. I just want to state that I'm deeply concerned that the allotted amount of time we're getting to review the department's gainful employment proposals insufficient. In the past, entire rulemakings have been dedicated to this rule, and at best now we've got 3 hours left of today and maybe one day in the next session to discuss the most important rule for our industry in many years. Schools will go out of business, people will lose their jobs, and students will be left with nowhere to go while our economy has over 10 million open jobs today. There are around 18 million students in all of higher education, of which only 1.2 million are attending proprietary schools. Many industries facing critical job shortages, like was just shown on 60 Minutes with nursing, could lose programs that are helping fill the employment gap. And while the department proposal contains some components of the 2014 rule that we'll review today, the 2022 proposal differs in so many significant ways that I'll be highlighting throughout the day. The 2014 rule at least had components that improved the quality and fairness, and unfortunately the new proposed 2022 rules remove so many significant items that it appears the department did not really use the 2014 rule as a starting place as requested by this committee. As I previously stated in week 1, our view is that all students in all programs and all institutions would benefit from debt to earning rate information calculated in this rule. And Adam's presentation is a great lead-in to the fact that they did not include programs not subject to gainful employment in their review, but a report issued this week from the Texas Public Policy Foundation, a 501c3 nonprofit, nonpartisan research institute, actually published a report that I'll drop in the chat that finds that gainful employment rules were applied to all programs in all sectors of higher education using recent data. 51% of the programs failing in total would be at private nonprofits, and 39% would be at public institutions, and 11% would be at for-profit institutions. The research continues to highlight the loophole of the gainful employment rule that misses about 90 or 89% of programs at nonprofit and publics that leave students with unmanageable levels of debt relative to their income. The department has argued that it lacks statutory authority to require degree programs and institutions of higher education to comply with the gainful employment rule. As I've repeatedly have observed, the department has the authority to require all programs at all institutions to demonstrate compliance with DE rates under its statutory quality assurance authority at Title 20 USC Section 1087D, subsection A, paragraph 4. There is no need or requirement to the department to not attach the department's accountability framework to the gainful employment concept. But can you speak to the time issue that we now have 3 hours to discuss this issue?
Yeah, but I will speak to that time issue, Brad. I understand that given the number of topics that we have on this table, that there is less time devoted to GE than has been in the past, and that the time constraints are tight. I don't intend to restrict anybody's ability or right as part of this group to make any comments they want to on any of these topics as we go through. So this is not, there's no intent on the part of the department to circumscribe anything here. So certainly all those points you want to bring up, you will have the opportunity to do so, as will any other members of the committee. I understand your point about the extent to which these rules align with these proposed rules align with what we had in 2014. I do admit or stipulate rather that there are some significant differences, but I would maintain that we have pretty much adopted the framework of the 2014 rule, and in doing that have adhered to the spirit of what was requested by the committee during the last session. We will. I will do my best to get through these. As I said before, where anybody feels they have to stop and to make a point, or to go back and reiterate something, or if there's something they feel they've missed that they want to review, please feel free to do that. Other than that, I will just say that we have the time that we have, and I'll make we'll make every effort to cover these rules in their entirety over the course of today.
And Greg, to my second question, can you comment if the department looked into its statutory authority to apply this debt to earning rates to all programs under 20 USC section 1087D subsection A paragraph 4?
We have considered that. The department's position as that as to why we're including only GE programs is our continued concern about the problems we do have concerns about earnings across the board for low earnings and high debt programs across the board, and that's one of the reasons why we are going to propose disclosures across all sectors. However, that said, in this rulemaking, we are proposing to clarify the eligibility requirements that are specific to gainful employment programs, and that has been true under the Higher Education Act for decades. That there is a specific reference to gainful employment programs that apply only to for-profit and certificate programs, and we are maintaining that position from the previous rules. I understand that there is disagreement on that subject, but that is where the department has landed. And if you, as far as the law goes, I can invite my counsel, Steve, to comment on that.
Yeah, thanks, Greg, and thanks, Brad, for raising the question. I mean, there's an established basis for the department to regulate under the gainful employment language in the Higher Education Act here, and that's what we're continuing to use. There are efforts to broaden the amount of information that's under consideration for all programs here, and that's the framework that's in front of everyone for discussion. I understand that you've identified other statutory authority that could possibly be used to try to establish similar requirements for every program, but that's not the proposal in front of us for discussion right now.
Thank you, Steve.
Before we get to Barmack really quickly, just wanted to announce that Ashley Schofield is in for minority serving institutions. And then Barmack, you are up.
Yeah, in the interest of time, I'm not going to belabor the point, but I just wanted to point out that given the fact that you now have fairly mechanical upfront requirements in 610 and 621, it would really be helpful for the department to articulate some fairly minimal upfront criteria before a program can be approved. Simple things like a market study that indicates the program is likely to pass the scores, some kind of vetting of it upfront. And this is a particularly important issue because I'm not sure what the department intends to do with the debt of students that it allowed to be plugged into programs as almost as guinea pigs to see if the program is good. What happens to those people when the program fails becomes a real significant moral issue. So I would encourage the department to contemplate a little bit more substance on the front end before it approves programs. Thank you.
Thank you, Murray.
Thank you. Johnson, you're up.
Thanks. Could I go back and ask Chris Bennett a question about one of the papers that he presented?
Sure.
So, Chris, are you there? Hi. Yeah. So I had a little more time to look at the first paper you presented with Table 1. I just want to make sure I understand it because I think it answers my question that I was concerned about of how many people are affected by GE, not just the programs. So Table 1, the column to the right, entitled percent number of all T4 completers in GE programs and programs with less than 30 T4 completers. So the 4% in that 2-year cohort, that's actually means 96% have an N number above 30 and hence would be covered. Is that right?
Students at proprietary GE programs are in programs that have 30 or more completers.
Okay, great.
So they would be covered, yes.
And so if you go to the second page of that paper, which has the table continuing on it, the number that's almost 1 million is the number of students who would be covered by the GE rule. Is that right?
I'm sorry, could you say that one more time?
The 996,000 student or number in the far column to the right, in the upper right, is that the number of students at a for-profit school that would be covered under GE?
Yes, that's the title for completers at GE programs in the proprietary sector. Yeah.
And there's this difference between a 2-year cohort versus a 4-year cohort. Is this basically saying by extending the analysis by 2 more years, you're only protecting 2% more students? Is that right?
So it's showing it reduces the share that aren't covered basically in half across each sector. And since it was 96% to begin with in the proprietary sector, it's 98%. So it makes a bigger difference in the public and nonprofit sectors. But across all of them, it reduces it about by half.
I see. Okay. Okay. Thank you very much.
And one just confirmation from earlier, it is the 4-digit zip code that is used in this small programs analysis.
Thank you.
Thanks, Chris. Let's see. We have Adam up next.
Sure. I don't want to put too fine a point on this, but just going back to Brad's comments and the comments we've gotten a couple times about applying these standards to all institutions. It is my understanding that these provisions are being proposed under the sections of the higher education that specifically instruct that only certain proprietary institutions and vocational programs are eligible for financial aid. So in other words, it's the statute itself. It's the Higher Education Act that specifies that these programs, only certain programs should receive the privilege of federal financial aid and taxpayer support when they're purported to prepare students for gainful employment in a recognized occupation. And since enactment, Congress has drawn that distinction. So, to push that these standards need to apply to all institutions is just at odds with the statute. And it really, in my view, doesn't have any relevant place in this conversation over these potential implementing regulations. And that argument I really think should be made to Congress. So, I think it's the department's goal. I think it's all of our goals to, seek to implement the intent of the Higher Education Act and the intent of Congress in good faith. And so I just find this discussion over whether these standards should apply to other institutions to be completely misplaced. And I'm looking forward to talking about, the specifics of the standards, what's workable, what's effective, et cetera. So that's my comment. Thanks.
Thank you, Adam. And Brad, you're up.
Well, in the department's opening proposal, it says here that we're here to collectively draft regulations that improve outcomes for all students. And we have the opportunity here to do that. So I'd like to present a proposal for everyone to think about over the lunch break here, that even though the department declines to use its statutory quality assurance authority to extend its accountability framework to all institutions, it still can and should require all institutions to calculate and disclose DE rates for informational purposes. Under Title 20 USC Section 1092, the department is authorized to require the calculation and disclosure of a wide range of institutional and financial assistance data. The professional licensure disclosures now required under 668.43 are based on this authority, and I'm excited to see that the department has included Section 668.43 in this proposal that we're reviewing today. I'm requesting that the agency can and should move the entire debt to earning rate calculations and disclosure framework under 668.43, requiring all institutions to calculate and disclose informational DE rates for their programs. The department can require all institutions to calculate and disclose DE rates for informational purposes while still using debt to earning rates to determine eligibility for gainful employment programs under its proposed subpart Q. The calculation and disclosure of DE rates for all institutions is authorized under Title 20 USC 1092, while the authority to use DE rates to determine the eligibility of gainful employment programs for the department is separately authorized under Title 20 USC 1002. There is no sound policy justification for denying debt to earning rate information to students in degree programs at all institutions of higher education. If debt to earning rates are deemed important and useful information, they are important and useful for all students. According to the department's own data, in the fourth quarter of fiscal year 2021, there were 8.4 million, or 76% of the students participating in income-driven repayment plans went to public or nonprofit institutions. These are graduates who have represented to the department that they are not able to afford their student loan debt based on their income and family size. And the majority of these students attended programs outside of the proprietary sector. To summarize, I'm proposing to move the debt to earning metric calculations into Section 668.43, while still only applying debt to earning rates for eligibility in the federal direct loan program to gainful employment programs defined in our current proposal in subpart Q. Thus, nonprofit and public institutions would not lose federal direct loan eligibility over failing scores. Also, the College Transparency Act bill,
30 seconds, Brad.
The College Transparency Act bill, which is moving through Congress, is another indication that policymakers are demanding more data. Implementing this approach is more likely to be supported by all future administrations and would greatly benefit and protect all students in higher education.
Thank you, Brad. Go ahead, Jimmy.
For Greg and Steve, now that 668.43 is open, thoughts about moving the debt to earning metrics into that section and referencing it within the gainful employment calculation, please.
I don't think I'm not going to comment on that right now. It's just, this was just brought up, but we will take it back and discuss it.
I would like to talk about that after lunch. I think that'd be very important protection for all students at all institutions and all programs, and still get to the nature of the GE rule. And the GE rule specifically did not define a metric. We created these metrics, and we'll debate the thresholds on these metrics, but there's no metrics defined in the gainful employment statute. So again, this could be very beneficial to all students and all programs. And I will tell you, I don't know why this has gotten so political. I've got 2 kids about ready to go to college, and I surely would like to know this information before they would go. And I bet everyone else on this committee would like to know that information.
Brad, thank you for your comments, and the department has asked for time to look into it. So with that, Kevin, you want to move us along?
Just wanted to see, I know if there's any comments limited to 600.10 or 600.21. We are coming up, towards the 12 o'clock break. So if there are, I'd ask for them to be brief. And if not, then I will turn it back over to Greg.
Thank you, Kevin.
Right.
Yeah, so before, in the brief time we have before lunch, let's move into 668.402, which is our definitions. And want to make a couple of points here. In this section, we have continued, we outline definitions that are used throughout the subpart, and many of these mirror what was in 2014. But I want to talk a little bit about a few of the changes that we have made here. And the main one here is the zip code. We previously used a 6-digit zip code to identify instructional programs. We're now going to use the first 4 digits of the zip code for the purpose of calculating debt to earnings rates. This will allow us to overcome some of the challenges associated with ensuring data are available and releasable while still ensuring the privacy of student data. It's also consistent with how we currently classify the fields of study on the college scorecard. So in looking at the definitions, you can see there where that is indicated under the classification of instructional program zip code, taxonomy of instructional program classifications, and descriptions developed by the U.S. Department of Education's National Center for Education Statistics, and specific programs offered by institutions are classified using a 6-digit zip code. However, for the purpose of this subpart, the Secretary uses the first 4 digits of the zip code to identify gainful employment programs and have comparable content and objectives. So that's the main change there. Everything else you see there below, we have the annual earnings rate and indicate that is the calculation for that is found in 668.404. We also described the cohort period. This is a carryover from 14, so we can just review this briefly. The Secretary will use a 2-year cohort period to calculate the debt to earnings rates for a program when the number of students after exclusions that are identified in 404E in the 2-year cohort period is 30 or more. The Secretary uses a 4-year cohort period to calculate the debt to earnings rates when the number of students completing the program in the 2-year cohort period is less than 30, and when the number of students completing the program in the 4-year cohort period is 30 or more. The cohort period covers consecutive award years that are described below. So it's you can look there for the 2-year cohort period. It's the third and fourth year prior to the award year for which DE rates are calculated, with an example given there for you in the reg, and for a program whose students are required to complete a medical or dental internship or residency, the 6th and 7th award years prior to the award year for which DE rates are calculated. And then we go into a discussion of how those are, which years are used for the 4-year cohort period. Under 2, you can see that it's the 3rd, 4th, 5th, and 6th award years prior to the award year for which DE rates are calculated. And then for a program who's required for a medical or dental internship, it's the 6th, 7th, 8th, and 9th award years prior to the award year for which the DE rates are calculated. Moving down into credential level, below that, the level of academic credential awarded by an institution to students who complete the program. And for the purpose of this subpart, the undergraduate credential levels are undergraduate certificate or diploma, associate degree, bachelor's degree, and post-baccalaureate certificate. And graduate credential levels are graduate certificate, including postgrad certificate, and master's, doctoral, and first professional degree. A couple of things to point out here in some of our other definitions under earnings. I want to point out, and again, most of what you're seeing here is a carryover from 14, but where we have federal agency with earnings data, I want to make one clarification here in the brief time before we go to lunch. We have added a new definition of federal agency with earnings data. Previously, we established agreements with multiple federal agencies to obtain these earnings data. For example, both Treasury and SSA access the same earnings information. HHS maintains in the National Directory of New Hires, and the Census Bureau has established partnerships with some state systems to produce high quality earnings information. So we propose to allow the department to use the agency with access to earnings information, provided these data are sufficient to match at least 90% of Title IV graduates, ensuring they provide high quality and accurate information. So this is giving us a broader scope or a broader range of agencies from which to request that data. And it being 12 o'clock, I'll turn it back over to the facilitators.
Yes, it is 12 o'clock. This is time for the break. We'll be breaking from 12 to 1 for lunch. Everyone have a good lunch, and then we'll go ahead and resume back with gainful employment, back with the definitions as we were just getting into. So we can take a break and see everyone at 1 o'clock.
Thank you.